Hi, here's some quick information on how to make your own gaskets using a Cricut Arts & Crafts scrapbooking machine. This is not a step-by-step tutorial, rather just an overview of the process so that you can decide if you want to give it a try. The first step is to trace the part onto paper. This tracing is then scanned into your computer and imported into Photoshop or another graphics application. Another method is to scan the old gasket or even the part itself. This photo is of a flat engine end cover that's scanned really well. Next, you need to recreate the scanned image from scratch using Photoshop. These techniques cannot be explained in this video. It will require a good knowledge of Photoshop, and there are several ways of accomplishing this goal depending on the shapes that you need to create and whatever method works best for you. Looking closely at this picture, you can see where I created rectangles and circles and superimposed them onto the scanned image. This was an easy item to do since the only elements involved are simple rectangles and circles, but with more complicated shapes, like the water pump housing shown in the first picture, it will become more difficult, requiring you to use Photoshop's collection of lasso tools and working with selections. It is very important to remember to create a new Photoshop layer for every element of the gasket. You can see at the right of the picture where I have layers for each circle and for each rectangle, in addition to the layer for the background, which is the original scan. You will see when you cut your test gaskets that most likely you will have to resize or move some of the lines, circles, and holes in order to make everything line up correctly with the part. Looking again at the picture of the tracing of the water pump housing, you might ask, why not just use this for the final template? The reason is that the Cricut machine is very precise and it will duplicate every nuance in the image, resulting in a sloppy cut that will take a long time to complete. The last step in Photoshop before saving is to hide the background layer. This will reveal only the new shapes that you just created, which is what Cricut will use as a template for the cut. You must save the project in PSD, the native Photoshop format, so that you can go back and make corrections as required. Then save it as a JPEG. This JPEG image will now get imported into the Cricut Design Space application. Next, you have to tell Cricut which areas of the image to cut. This is done by clicking on the areas of the image with the tool, creating a blue shaded area. This file is then saved into the My Projects section of the Cricut software. When you are ready to cut the gasket, you will import the image into the Cricut canvas. It's important to note that the imported image will not be the correct size, and this is where a lot of trial and error starts. You will need to physically measure the original gasket or part. For example, it's 4 inches from edge to edge, 5 inches between the center of the holes, etc. Then you will stretch the image on the Cricut canvas by dragging the arrows. The grid on the canvas on your screen corresponds to the grid on the green Cricut cutting mat. Adhere the paper to the mat by pressing down. Set the cutting depth for paper and make a test cut. Compare this paper test gasket to the actual part. This is where you will determine what changes to be made. For example, the inner circle needs to be smaller, or the holes need to be closer together, or whatever. These changes need to be made to the PSD Photoshop file, which will then need to be resaved and re-imported into Cricut Design Space. In many cases, the overall size of the image needs to be changed, and this can easily be done in Design Space by dragging the arrows. You need to go through this process as many times as it takes to get a correct sample. The final step is to cut the actual gasket material. The Cricut's depth of cut adjustments will be another source of trial and error until you get the blade to cut the material at just the right depth. Finally, it's time to make the final cut. The gasket material does not stick well to the cutting mat, especially after it gets worn down after several cuts, so it helps to guide the material in and out of the machine while it's cutting, much like you would do with a sewing machine. The final result was very satisfying, but it did take quite some time to complete, mostly due to the learning curve involved. You can see the work that's involved by this picture of the mess that I created with all of the trial cuts that were involved. This is my project all completed. Is it easier and cheaper to buy a complete engine set from Felpro? Of course. But in my case, I am working on a 1922 Reo Speedwagon fire truck, so even if I could find gaskets for it, they will be at a real high price from a restoration supply source. So this is a great solution for those who are working on antique or unusual vehicles. As car guys, who knows what other uses we can come up with, such as graphics or lettering. Thanks for watching. As I said in the beginning, this is not a step-by-step tutorial, but it should give you enough information for you to decide if this is something you'd like to try for yourself.